Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to dig into the sources, pull out those key insights, and help you get, well, truly informed. Today, we're diving into something really fascinating, the Human Dimensions Evolution Framework. It's a powerful way to think about ourselves, how we connect with others, and, that whole journey of growth we're all on.
That's right. It's a model drawn from a lot of thinking on human psychology behavior, and it outlines 4, let's say, distinct stages. It really helps understand the why behind our actions, not just the what. We'll be talking about the animal being, the animal human being, then the human being, and finally the divine human being.
And honestly, whether you're trying to lead a team or raise your kids, maybe navigate your marriage, or even just figure yourself out, this deep dive is definitely for you. Okay, so let's unpack this. Where do we start? The first dimension.
Let's start right at the base, the animal being. This is someone who's primarily running on, let's call them base instincts, fear, anger, greed, maybe a raw need for dominance. And what's really crucial here is that guilt. Well, it's either missing or buried deep down. The focus is just overwhelmingly on survival, immediate self-interest.
Okay.
Their brain orientation in this model is heavily emotional. Think like 90% emotional, maybe 10% logical processing going on. And this stage often comes with very high narcissism, that intense self-focus, and also a tendency towards fanaticism, like a really rigid way of seeing things.
Wow, 90% emotional. That lack of guilt, the pure survival focus, it sounds pretty intense. Does the framework suggest they just have zero empathy? Or is it just sort of drowned out by those instincts?
It suggests it's profoundly underdeveloped, yeah. The main driver is self-preservation, getting what they need now. So the ability to really feel or grasp another person's viewpoint is either not there yet, or it's just completely overshadowed. It's not about being bad necessarily, but operating from a very, very basic instinctual level.
Okay, so if that's the animal, pure instinct, survival, what happens when, a little bit of self-awareness creeps in? That takes us to the next one, right? The animal human being. Things get more complicated inside then.
Exactly. This is where you start to see a real internal shift. These individuals, they do feel regret. Often they'll say they want to do better, they want to change, but, and this is the key, they often get stuck in those old habits. There's a lot of internal conflict, a real battle between what they want to do and what they actually end up doing.
Right.
The brain orientation here shifts a bit, maybe 70% emotional, 30% logical now. Narcissism and fanaticism are still there, but maybe more moderate. But that internal struggle, that gap you mentioned, that's the defining feature. Knowing better, but struggling to do better consistently.
Yeah, I think many of us can probably relate to spending some time there, can't we? That pull between impulse and knowing what's right.
Absolutely. It's a very common human experience, that tension. It's a really crucial transition point in this model.
So, moving on then. The human being. This sounds like where things start to balance out.
Yes, significantly. This is someone who acts with a clearer sense of purpose. There's genuine empathy. They operate from a core set of values. These are often the people you just instinctively feel safe around.
Yeah.
They feel stable, honest.
Yeah.
They have emotional intelligence.
And the brain balance reflects that.
It does. It's seen as much more balanced, 50% emotional, 50% logical. So emotions are still there, definitely, but they're integrated with reason. And narcissism and fanaticism are low here.
So it's not about getting rid of emotions, but about managing them, working with them.
Precisely. It's about regulation, making thoughtful decisions, aligning actions with values, even when it's tough. That's the human stage.
Okay. And then the final stage, the divine human being. The description sounds, pretty rare, highly evolved. What really sets this stage apart?
It is described as rare, yes? And highly evolved. These individuals, they seem to radiate a kind of deep calm. They naturally uplift people around them. Their life isn't driven by ego anymore, but by a search for deeper meaning, for service to something beyond themselves.
And the brain orientation shifts again.
Dramatically. It's seen as predominantly logical, maybe 70% logical, 30% emotional. And crucially, the framework suggests effectively no narcissism or fanaticism at this level. It's a state of profound wisdom, you could say, and genuinely selfless action.
It sounds almost like an ideal. Given how rare it is, does the framework give any clues on how someone might, even start moving in that direction? Or is it just this peak that very few reach?
I think it's a bit of both. The sources suggest moving along the spectrum isn't usually about huge dramatic leaps. It's often about those small, consistent choices we make every day. Choices that gradually shift that internal balance, moving from just reacting to being more intentional. So while the divine human stage might be an ideal, the journey itself, that growing awareness, that conscious choice, That's how we move along the spectrum, wherever we happen to be.
That makes sense. Small steps. Okay, so we have these 4 dimensions. How do they actually show up, in the real world? Like, let's take the workplace, corporate life. That can be a real pressure cooker.
Oh, absolutely. In the workplace, an animal being, well, that might look like the boss who, maybe under pressure, humiliates someone publicly for a small mistake, or takes all the credit for team successes but points fingers when things go wrong. And they might genuinely not lose sleep over it. It looks like strength, maybe, but often it's fear wearing a power suit. Think of that classic toxic manager bullying, maybe manipulative, power hungry, showing no real guilt.
Yeah, unfortunately, that sounds familiar to some. Okay, what about the animal human leader? How do they show up?
They're different. They might blow up in a meeting or make a tough call badly, but afterwards they feel that pang of guilt. Maybe they try to smooth it over, apologize, buy coffee for everyone.
Yeah.
But when the pressure's back on next quarter, that same negative pattern often pops right back up. It's almost predictable. Like, imagine a salesperson who keeps over-promising to hit targets. They know it's wrong. They might feel bad later, but in the moment, the pressure wins.
So what is it about this stage? Why is it so hard to break those cycles, even with the guilt?
It comes back to that brain orientation, still weighted towards emotion. The logical part knows, feels the remorse, sure. But those emotional drivers hitting the target, fear of failing, needing approval, they're still stronger, more ingrained. They want to change genuinely, but that internal muscle, that ability to override the impulse consistently, it just hasn't been built up enough yet.
Okay, so contrast that with the human boss. What's their approach?
Well, they guide, they support, they actually listen, even when making difficult decisions. They tend to create environments where people feel safe, psychologically safe, and those often become high-performing teams because there's trust. Think of a CEO who doesn't just talk about ethics and well-being, but actually builds structures to support them. They're purpose-driven, seem fair, take accountability, and they're focused on helping their people grow. They get that real success is built on that safety.
That stability, that empathy, it feels so different. How would a human leader handle conflict, maybe with someone operating from a lower dimension?
That's a great question. The framework suggests they wouldn't meet aggression with aggression. They wouldn't try to dominate. They'd likely try to understand the behavior, not just attack the person. They'd address the issue, aiming for resolution, maybe even growth, rather than just punishment or control.
Right. And then the divine human leader. You mentioned Satya Nadella, Dr. Abdul Kalam. These are really inspiring figures. What defines them in a leadership role?
It's that deep vision, isn't it? And a noticeable lack of ego driving their decisions. They seem fundamentally service-minded. Like a global social leader, maybe, who has this deep humility. They're detached from needing personal glory. They seem wise, focused on legacy, not just quarterly results. It reminds me of that Jack Welch quote. Before you are a leader, success is about growing yourself. When you become leader, success is about growing others.
That quote really captures it. But given how rare they are, how much impact can one leader like that really have in a huge company or on the world stage?
I think their impact could be massive, actually. Maybe disproportionate to their numbers. They don't lead just through force or even charisma. They lead by inspiring change in others. Their influence isn't about top-down control. It's more like they catalyze growth. They align people around something meaningful, something bigger than themselves. Their very presence can kind of elevate the whole system.
Okay, fascinating to see it laid out in the corporate world. But these patterns, they don't just start when we get jobs, do they? Let's shift focus. What about earlier in life? Students, young professionals just starting out.
Well, you see it clearly there too.
Right.
An animal student. That might be the kid who cheats without thinking twice. Or the bully mocking others, maybe online. Like a cyberbully, just being disrespectful, trolling, seeming to have zero grasp of the consequences or the pain they're causing. Their world is very much about their own immediate urges or frustrations.
And the animal-human student, the one with that glimmer of awareness.
Yeah, they might cheat too. But then they go home and they feel awful about it. They promise themselves, never again. But then, peer pressure kicks in. Or maybe just the easy path looks too tempting. And they fall back into it. This is that student who feels remorseful after doing wrong. Yeah, guilt-ridden maybe, but still really driven by emotions and lacking that strong internal control to resist pressure.
How much does that environment, like the peer group, really play a role at this stage?
Oh, hugely. At this animal-human stage, you're still very susceptible to what's going on around you. That internal compass, it's just not fully calibrated yet, not strong enough to consistently guide behavior. So yeah, the pull of the social group or just the path of least resistance, it can easily override that emerging sense of right and wrong.
Right. But then you have the human student. What do they look like?
These are the students who seem responsible, self-motivated. They're often collaborative. Maybe they take the lead in group projects, not to dominate, but to make sure things get done well. They might mentor friends. Crucially, they do what they think is right, even if nobody's watching. Think of a peer mentor, maybe, or a student council rep who genuinely cares. They seem balanced, value respect, enjoy working with others. They have that internal compass.
So it's about self-accountability starting to really take hold.
Exactly. They don't need the teacher looking over their shoulder or the promise of a reward or fear of punishment to do the right thing. Their actions come more from an internal set of values, a desire to contribute positively.
And even at this age, are there divine human students? It seems remarkable.
The framework suggests yes, though they are rare. They just seem to radiate this quiet integrity. They'll help others without expecting anything back. They inspire people just by being themselves. Maybe that kid who just naturally uplifts classmates, shows incredible empathy, no ego involved, and really makes you think of that John Wooden quote again. Character is what you do when no one is watching.
Yeah, it's powerful to imagine someone embodying that so young. It speaks to a real inner alignment, doesn't it?
It really does.
Yeah.
An inner peace, maybe, that allows them to put the collective good first, even in competitive school environments. They don't just act with integrity, they are integrity.
Okay, so we grow up, we become adults, but as we know, adulthood doesn't automatically equal maturity, does it? We've all seen proof of that. How do these dimensions play out when we're talking about mature adults, maybe in families?
Right. Unfortunately, you can see animal traits in adults too. They might project their own baggage, their own trauma onto others. They might be controlling, use guilt trips, or just shut down completely if challenged. There's often a strong resistance to looking inward, to self-reflection. You might see it in a parent who rigidly forces outdated values onto their kids, who blames others, reacts intensely, maybe manipulates situations. Their decisions seem driven by ego, insecurity, maybe a need for power, not real connection.
And the animal-human adult, the one who feels the conflict.
Yep. They recognize their flaws sometimes. They feel bad after a big argument. They apologize. But that deep, lasting change, it often doesn't quite stick. Think of someone who gets caught up in gossip, feels terrible about it later, apologizes maybe, but finds themselves doing it again. There's that struggle between wanting to be seen well, maybe maintain a certain social image, and their own personal ethics. Often the image wins out.
What holds them back, do you think, from making that sustained shift?
Often it's those really deeply ingrained emotional patterns, those triggers that just fire up under stress. The desire for change is real. But the emotional regulation skills, the self-awareness to actually interrupt those old habits in the heat of the moment, they're still developing. It's that constant push-pull dynamic again.
Okay. So the human adult, how do they navigate adulthood?
Well, they're more likely to readily admit when they mess up. And importantly, they actively try to learn from it. They tend to model calmer, more effective ways of dealing with things, both at home and at work. That's a great way to put it. Often seen as, a spiritual elder in their family or community. They guide, but without judgment. They forgive easily. They tend to listen much more than they talk. You might picture a grandparent maybe just quietly teaching life values through their actions, their presence. They seem spiritually grounded, ego-free, naturally mentoring and uplifting others. It really brings home that idea that maturity is when you stop blaming others for your pain. That's a huge shift, isn't it?
It really is, moving from reacting to, responding from a place of inner peace and responsibility.
Exactly. Their presence itself becomes a source of calm and wisdom.
Okay, this next one. It feels like it could hit close to home for many. Relationships. People often say relationships are like mirrors, showing us our deepest stuff. How does this framework help us understand partner dynamics?
Oh, profoundly. An animal relationship based on this framework.
Yeah.
It's fundamentally toxic, usually dominated by one partner. There's control, blame, maybe emotional or even physical abuse, real intimacy, vulnerability. It's just not there. It's more about transaction or maintaining control through fear. This is the spouse who demands control, is disrespectful, maybe abusive, manipulative. The relationship exists solely to meet their needs.
That sounds incredibly difficult. What about the animal-human stage in a relationship? More common, maybe?
Probably more common, yes.
Yeah.
Here you see that cycle, outbursts, maybe intense arguments followed by guilt and remorse. Apologies happen, I'll never do it again, but the pattern often repeats. There might be genuine love there, moments of affection, but it's tangled up with pain and instability. This is the spouse who apologizes after an emotional blow up, but then does it again. They fluctuate between affection and ego. Love might feel conditional. There's a clear lack of emotional regulation. It can feel like a real roller coaster.
Yeah, a cycle of hope and then disappointment, maybe.
That captures it well. There's real affection. But the inability to consistently manage those intense emotions means connection gets fractured repeatedly. The intention is good, but the capacity for consistently healthy interaction isn't fully there yet.
So a human relationship, what does that look like? Is it conflict free?
Not conflict free, no. Conflict is part of being human. But the way conflict is handled is different. It's built on a foundation of shared decision-making, mutual respect, and a commitment to growth, both individually and as a couple. When conflicts happen, there's also a process for healing, for resolution. They work through it together. These are partners genuinely supporting each other's goals, communicating openly, functioning as equals. It's a real partnership.
So it's about navigating the difficulties together from a place of respect.
Exactly. True partnership. Both people are invested in the well-being and growth of the other, not just focused on their own needs. They understand the relationship itself needs conscious effort, give and take, mutual support.
And finally, divine human couples. This sounds like the ultimate relationship goal for some.
It's depicted as a very deep, rare connection, marked by profound trust, incredible emotional safety, often a strong spiritual connection that underpins everything. The relationship isn't just about them, it often becomes a positive force radiating outward. Think of a couple that just embodies trust and peace. They seem spiritually bonded. Their connection feels rooted in trust, maybe sacrifice, deep compassion. They uplift each other. It makes you think of that phrase, love is the absence of control, the presence of connection. That really sums it up.
Wow. It's hard to imagine a more beautiful dynamic than that. A shared purpose beyond just the relationship itself.
Yes. They're not just partners navigating life. They seem to be catalysts for each other's deepest growth and maybe even contribute positively to the world around them through their connection.
Okay. So we've journeyed through these 4 dimensions, seen how they might play out in work, in school, in families, in love. It really makes you think, doesn't it? Where do you, listening right now, see yourself today? Maybe in your job or in your relationships or just in your own inner world. And maybe more importantly, where do you feel like you're heading?
And remember, it's important to understand we all fluctuate. It's not like you're fixed in one box forever.
Yeah.
You might be, say, a pretty solid human parent most of the time. But maybe under intense pressure at work or in a conflict with your spouse, you slip back into animal-human reactions. And that's okay. The key thing really is awareness. Awareness is the first step in any kind of evolution. The moment you can start observing yourself, your reactions, your patterns, without judging yourself harshly, you're already starting to rise. That's self-observation. That's the engine for shifting that internal balance, moving away from pure reactivity towards more conscious intention.
That's a really important point. It's not about achieving perfection overnight. Growth doesn't demand perfection. Maybe just presence, honesty with yourself, and that willingness to maybe just take a breath, pause for a second before you react. That tiny pause can make such a huge difference sometimes.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive through the 4 human dimensions. If anything we talked about today stirred something in you, maybe share it with someone. And definitely take a moment just for yourself to reflect on your own journey.
Yeah. You can't choose where you started out on this path, but you absolutely can choose how you grow from here. Stay curious, stay kind to yourself and others, and keep evolving.